10 years or so, I've been working with National Geographic to identify geographically defined, demographically confirmed parts of the area where people live measurably longer. These are populations, of not just individual experience, tens of thousands of people in most examples. And then working with other experts to find their common denominators. I wrote this up in a book called Blue Zones. You don't have to buy the book because in the next 90 seconds I'm going to tell you all the essential secrets. No matter where you go in the world, whether it's Okinawa, Japan, Sardinia, Italy, the Highlands, the Nicoya Peninsula of Costa Rica, Ikaria, Greece, among the Seventh-day Adventists, you see the same 9 things happening over and over and over among the longest-lived people. A lot of these things are very intuitive. Eating a plant-based diet, low and simple carbohydrates, high in things like beans and nuts. The ever-popular prescriptive to have a couple glasses of wine a day. And no, you can't save up all week long and have 14 on the weekends. People actually ask me that. But the really cool findings come from the counterintuitive things. Do you know that people who have a strong sense of purpose and who can articulate it live about 7 years longer than people who don't? People who belong to a faith-based community and actually show up 4 times a month live 4 to 14 years longer than people who don't. And none of the longest-lived people in the world, and I interviewed 253 of them, ever exercised in the way we think of exercise. They did, however, live in environments that constantly nudge them into physical activity. They burnt about 5 times as many calories as we do in non-exercise physical activity. They lived anywhere from 7 to 11 years longer than we did, with a fraction of the rate of chronic disease. These are populations. One of them is even an American population that lives a decade longer than the rest of us. But as you know, you can tell people all day long the things they ought to do to live longer and to be healthier. But how do you actually get a population to do them? We spend almost $1 trillion a year on largely preventable diseases, cancer, diabetes, heart disease, largely preventable diseases. But I assert we not only are spending too much, but we're aiming at the wrong target. If you look at what really drives disease and cost in this country, about 80% of it is lifestyle and environment. Only about 10% is genes. This is on a population as a whole. And healthcare accounts for another 10% of it. But now look at the way we spend our money. This incidentally comes from the CDC. We spend only about 4% of all our healthcare dollars on prevention. And then we spend 88% of them on cleaning up the problem after the problem has happened. We're aiming at the wrong target. Instead of the downstream problems, we should be aiming at what to do before they happen. I think most of us know that. We do spend over $100 billion a year on prevention. So you may say, Dan, you know, we're an overweight population here in America. We don't move enough. We should be focusing on diets and exercise and supplements. The problem is, by and large, they don't work. When you think of things that are going to truly add to longevity, to truly lower your chances of getting a chronic disease, you cannot think in months or in years. You have to think in decades or a lifetime. So you say, well, diets, they're a pretty good idea. But no diet in the history of the world has ever worked for a significant proportion of people who started. We could come up right now, we could spend the next 3 days and come up with the TED Med diet. The best minds on the planet when it comes to medicine come up with a TED Med diet. We get Mark up here and Jay up here, and we do a man hug, and we get people all pumped up about it. But the reality of diets, if 100 people start a diet today, within 7 to 10 months, you'll lose 90 of them. And within the next 2 years, you'll lose all but about 5% of them. So when it comes to a long-term strategy, diets don't work. No diet in the history of the world. Exercise has a similar recidivism curve. We were able to find data on gym memberships. Out of 100 people who start a gym membership today, in 3 years, you'll lose about 90% of them. This is a bit of a heresy, I know, but when it comes to public health, exercise just isn't working. The average American only burns 100 calories per day engaged in willful physical activity, exercise. Supplements, whether they're medicinal or nutraceutical, about the same thing. We may say statins and aspirin are really good for people to take, but you don't get a critical mass. You don't get enough people taking them over time. So based on these findings, I went back to National Geographic and I proposed another blue zone type worldwide search. But this time I wanted to find communities that were unhealthy and got themselves healthier. And God bless that rectangular yellow heart of National Geographic, they funded me. Went all over the world and found out two remarkable things. Number one, of the tens of millions of dollars we spend on public health initiatives that aim at chronic disease, none of them have worked. There's one in Minnesota, Heart Healthy. There's the one in Stanford, Connecticut, another one in California. What happens is more or less the health care equivalent of the Hawthorne effect. As long as the experts are there paying attention and the TV cameras are rolling, people will do what they ought to do, but as soon as they leave, people revert back to their baseline. So as a long-term strategy, it simply hasn't worked here in America. There are two places in the world where projects have started out with unhealthy people and made their populations healthier. One in France, northern France, the EPOL project, brought down the rates of childhood obesity and maintained them for 8 years. And the second place was in Scandinavia. They brought down the rate of cardiovascular disease by 90% and have maintained it for decades.